Welcome, everyone. Can you all hear me okay through the microphone? Yes, sweet. Okay, so today I am going to talk about navigating open source project risk. The slides are actually already available on the Fast Wonder blog speaking page. So if you go to fastwonderblog.com and click speaking, you can get slides. I also posted them on Twitter. So if you follow my Twitter handle, Geeky Girl Dawn here at the bottom, you can get slides that way. So today I am going to talk about evaluating risk for open source projects. I'll start with a brief overview of why it's important to think about risk from a strategic perspective. I'll talk about the difference between company-owned open source projects and projects under foundations, along with some thoughts on neutral governance and how all of this impacts risk. I'll also share some thoughts about what policies and other documents to look for, along with how to evaluate the community risks. Then I'll wrap it up with a few final thoughts and links to some useful resources. But first, I'll start by telling you just a bit about me. I have been in the technology industry for over 20 years, working mostly on open source projects from within companies like Puppet, Intel, and now at VMware, I'm responsible for our open source community strategy within the open source program office. I'm also on the steering committee for the Linux Foundation's to-do group, where companies collaborate on ways to run successful open source projects and open source program offices. I'm also a board member of Open UK, which is focused on developing and sustaining leadership in open technology in the UK where I live. I'm a governing board member and maintainer for the Linux Foundation's Chaos project, which is focused on using metrics to evaluate the health of open source projects. And I also have a PhD from the University of Greenwich, where I spent a few years researching how people collaborate within the Linux kernel. Unfortunately, the scenario on this slide is probably a lot more common than many people realize. One of the biggest examples of this was a couple of years ago when it was discovered that OpenSSL had a security bug in their cryptography library, which we called Heartbleed. OpenSSL is a technology that almost every company in the world uses in one way or another. And it was during this crisis that most of us learned that OpenSSL received about $2,000 in donations per year and was maintained mostly by a single person. So yes, that's right, software that we all use, all companies, everyone had almost no resources to actually maintain that software. And there are probably hundreds or thousands of other open source projects that are in the same or similar situations. And while this particular situation, Heartbleed, was resolved relatively quickly, we might not be so lucky in other cases. So evaluating risk is important because it can disrupt your business. It's also important to think about risk as being on a continuum. So like with most things in life, there are no sure bets and no project, open source or otherwise, and no technology is completely without risk. There are only projects with more or less risk across a wide variety of categories. And whether you should accept that risk is a business decision and a strategic decision that should also take how you're using that project into account. It's important to think about risk as part of your company and product strategies. I'll talk in more detail about the various elements of risk throughout this presentation, but I wanted to start by talking about why our strategies should take risk into account. I can start with an example of why this is important from a VMware perspective. We're shifting more and more of our business to software as a service or SaaS model, which means we're embracing quite a few cloud native technologies. And as you can see from this eye chart, no, that's not an eye chart. That's even just a subset. It's not even the whole CNCF landscape. But anyway, you can see that there are a lot of open source projects in this landscape and in the cloud native space in general. And some of them are more risky than others. And one of the things that I've been evangelizing within VMware, along with externally at conferences like this, is that we need to think carefully and strategically about which projects we embrace as part of our products. We don't want to build a key product or product line on top of some risky open source technology. So it's important to think about what elements of an open source project might introduce risk for us and how we can watch out for warning signs and mitigate these potential risks that I'll talk about throughout this presentation. I wanted to start by talking about why it's important to think about who owns or controls an open source project, because it's something that many of us don't spend as much time thinking about as we should. It was interesting to see Peter's keynote this morning because Peter talked a little bit about this. So I'll go into a bit more detail, but it's something I think a lot about. The project's governance documents can usually help you learn more about the ownership and control of a project. And from a risk perspective and a strategic perspective, you should be looking for projects with neutral governance, where decisions are made by people from a variety of different companies. Projects that are controlled by foundations and ones that are owned by an individual company can have very different dynamics and risks associated with participating in those projects. And I'll start with a couple of examples of what can happen with projects that don't have neutral governance. So the licensing risk, which is something that Peter also talked a little bit about. But license changes are one thing that can increase our business risk, especially when an open source project is controlled by a single company. There have been several companies who are fed up with cloud providers selling software as a service offerings based on open source projects without actually giving much back to those who are doing most of the development on those open source projects. Now, their solution was to use more restrictive licenses. In the case of MongoDB, they created a new license called the server-side public license that would be used for MongoDB moving forward, but would also be used for security patches for the previous open source versions of the software to prevent people from just continuing to use an older open source version. Elastic followed suit by moving Elasticsearch and Kibana under the SSPL. Now, what's important to note is that the SSPL is not an OSI approved open source license. What this means is that MongoDB, Elasticsearch, and Kibana are effectively no longer open source projects. And situations like these increase your business risk. And when you're building your product strategies, you should be thinking about whether this is a risk for the projects you're using and incorporating into your products. License changes require time from lawyers to interpret these new licenses, and new restrictions on how we use an open source project can delay our product delivery and decrease productivity if we need to spend extra time finding and implementing a suitable replacement. Governance issues caused by corporate ownership of open source projects can undermine a project's success and lead to disruptions within the project. In some cases, these disruptions make it difficult to make progress on a project, but they can also result in the project forking and becoming obviously two completely separate projects. Now, forking a project in particular can be extremely time consuming for the project. All of this takes precious time away from the development of the project and slows down progress until things sort of settle back down after the fork. And it increases business risk for companies who are using or contributing to the project. And here are a couple of relatively tangible examples. MySQL was forked into what became MariaDB when Oracle acquired Sun. And many of the original MySQL core developers, including the creator, Monty, didn't think that Oracle would be a good owner of MySQL. And they wanted to ensure that the code base would actually remain open. In a similar fashion, shortly after the same acquisition, LibreOffice was forked from OpenOffice. Now, both of these forks caused a very significant brain drain away from the original projects, since many of the original developers began working on the new forks. And in the case of LibreOffice, the fork became way more popular than the original project. One way we can avoid situations like I just talked about on the last couple of slides is by supporting projects that are under neutral foundations, like the Linux Foundation, whenever possible. However, it isn't always clear whether a foundation is neutral or not. If the board of directors or other leadership bodies are made up of people who work at a wide range of companies, especially if those are competing companies, that's a good indication that it's a neutral foundation. On the other hand, if the board members are made up primarily of people from a single company or a couple of companies with very close ties, it's probably not actually a neutral foundation. Trademarks are another thing to look at. In a neutral foundation, the foundation should own the trademarks associated with the name of the foundation and probably for most of the project. Now, if those trademarks are all owned by a company, especially a single company across most of the projects, that's a red flag. The foundation's probably not neutral. It can also help to look at the projects under that foundation. Were they originated at a single company, or do they come from a variety of companies? Do those projects have leaders from a variety of companies? Do they have CLAs, contributor license agreements, from one company, or is the contributor license agreement from the foundation? And the more you see references to a single company across the projects in the foundation, the less likely it is that that foundation is neutral. Now, there are loads of really fantastic neutral foundations: CNCF, Eclipse, Linux Foundation, Apache Software Foundation. Those are all solid neutral foundations. And these neutral foundations make it easier for companies, including competing companies, to collaborate together on open source projects. Neutral foundations usually help enforce neutral governance for those projects, which means that anyone can contribute and eventually earn a leadership role within that project. With no single company in control, foundation-owned projects are lower risk because if there are any issues within the project, we have a neutral place to escalate any concerns. Now, one of the reasons that Kubernetes has been so successful is because it was contributed to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Putting Kubernetes into a neutral foundation provided a level playing field where people from a whole bunch of different companies could work together as equals to create something that benefits the entire ecosystem. Open source projects that are controlled by a single company are higher risk because they operate at the whims of that company. And there's little recourse for outside contributors when that company decides to go in a direction that doesn't align with the expectations of the other participants within that community. So think back to the examples from earlier where projects moved to non-open source licenses or were forked. And many company originated open source projects, the leadership roles and influence are held solely by the employees of that company. And decisions are often made behind closed doors within that company with very little or no transparency. And this makes it very difficult for the rest of us to contribute and understand how and where those decisions are made. For company originated open source projects, consider the reputation of that company as a steward for open source projects. Not their overall reputation, but look closely at how they actually run open source projects that are originated at that company. And always keep in mind that they can actually change their strategy at some later date. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't participate in open source projects owned by companies. We do this all the time. We have lots of VMware originated open source projects, but you should think about the risks that you might be taking. In some cases, it makes a lot of sense to accept that higher risk. But you should at least try to make sure that you understand the risks that you're taking and how those risks could impact your company and your strategies. Governance can be found in all open source projects in one form or another, and it helps outline the expectations around roles and responsibilities along with the decision-making processes. But it will vary quite a bit by project and especially by size of the project. A project with only a few people will not need elaborate elections to select leaders, but the project should have at least a few basic roles defined, like contributor and maintainer, for example. Knowing how collaboration occurs and how decisions are made is vital to being able to make contributions that are more likely to be accepted. If the processes for collaboration, leadership, and decision-making are not clearly documented as part of the project governance, this can increase the risk of participating in or using the project because it introduces an awful lot of uncertainty into the mix. Now, one way to help mitigate this risk is to have some discussions about governance within the community to gauge interest in getting some help with governance. In a lot of communities, there can be various types of informal governance that just isn't documented. And quite a few people tend to avoid working on governance because it just seems like paperwork. So if it's missing, you might be able to volunteer to help. And it's a great way to learn more about how the community actually operates. On the other hand, sometimes governance is missing because someone doesn't want the governance to be documented. For example, the project might be very tightly controlled by a company or a group of people in ways that they don't want to make explicit. Or maybe someone doesn't want neutral governance process that might require them to give up some control. Or in some cases, project leaders might, frankly, just be naive enough to think that it isn't important. In these cases, your attempts to help with governance will likely be met with stonewalling, avoidance, even hostility. And this makes the project a much higher risk since your governance concerns aren't likely to be mitigated. Because leadership is such a critical piece of governance, I wanted to spend just a little more time talking specifically about it. At a minimum, there should be some kind of documentation about leadership within the project. There might be committees, working groups, special interest groups, or other groups with opportunities for leadership. If you become an active participant in a project, you'll want to understand how contributors move into leadership roles. Having employees in leadership roles helps reduce your risk as a company, since these employees will be in a position to understand more about how the project really works and be able to mentor other employees into the project over time. And there are quite a few different options for selecting leaders as part of defining governance. And the ideal is to have a process that provides some sort of fair and level playing field that defines how contributors can become leaders. And this should be documented so that all participants can clearly understand the criteria and the process for moving both into and then possibly out of leadership positions over time. Some of the bigger projects like Kubernetes have an election process, at least for the top levels of leadership, like a steering committee. But the key is that having a fair and transparent process for selecting leaders, like elections, reduces your risk of participating, since your contributors can participate in the elections or other leadership processes and have a say in the governance of the project. Higher risk options would include organizational leadership seats, where a certain number of positions are allocated to specific companies, where those companies get to decide who gets their leadership positions, and there's no easy way for new leaders who work outside of these companies to move into leadership positions. But regardless of how leaders are selected, you want to make sure that there are opportunities for your contributors to move into leadership positions to reduce the risk for projects that you use and contribute to. Before I move into policies and documentation, any questions about what I've talked about so far? While I get a drink of water. Yep. Yeah, those are also both solid neutral foundations. There are quite a few of them, to be sure. There are also some that aren't so neutral. Open Usage Commons from Google. It's solidly controlled by Google. Okay. So in addition to the governance documentation, which I talked about before, there are quite a few other policies and documents that you can look at as part of your risk assessment for a project. People often worry about security for open source projects, under the premise that if everyone can see the code, they might also be able to find and exploit security vulnerabilities. But the flip side of this is that there are also more people who can view the source code for the purpose of fixing any potential security vulnerabilities. And within a product team working internally on a project, so not something that's open source, you have a limited number of people and an increased chance that your shared backgrounds within that company lead you to think of things in pretty similar ways. With people from many different companies and backgrounds contributing to an open source project, those innovative ideas will also apply to proactively making the project more secure, along with then reactively fixing any vulnerabilities that might arise at some point. Now, this certainly does not mean that open source projects are automatically secure. One thing I look for when assessing the risk of open source projects is whether they make regular releases and quickly patch security vulnerabilities. You should also look at the project's security policy documents to make sure that they have a solid process for allowing anyone to privately report security vulnerabilities and for dealing with those reports quickly and efficiently. They should also have an embargo process, especially for the bigger projects, where they can privately notify companies who use their projects in their products to give those companies time to apply security fixes before those security vulnerabilities become public. And from a strategic standpoint, having time to update your products in advance of the public knowing about a vulnerability is critical. And in short, projects that take a proactive approach to addressing security issues and releasing fixes are going to be a lower risk for your company. There are a few documents that every project, even the small ones, should have. Open source projects need appropriate licensing documentation. Projects should also have a code of conduct that people can easily find with details about how to report incidents, along with the consequences of violating that code of conduct. The contribution documents should provide enough details about the contribution process so that someone who's brand new to the project can make their very first contribution. The communication process should also be clearly defined so that people know where and how to communicate within the project. If everyone understands how people within the project communicate with each other, it avoids frustrating experiences, both for new contributors, but also for your experienced contributors. Now, one way to mitigate these risks is to volunteer to help with some of this documentation. Long-term contributors who have been around the project forever may not notice that their documents are incomplete, incorrect, horribly out of date, and someone new to the project can often be a big help in finding the problems and improving the documentation, especially in areas where nobody noticed that there was an issue. And the better all of this is documented, the lower the risk, since your contributors will know what to expect and how to navigate the project when they make their contributions. The community can make or break an open source project. And the overall success of a project often depends a lot on the community. The community is usually the first thing I look at when trying to decide if an open source project is healthy. Is the community active and engaged in productive discussions around the project? Are they helpful when people have questions or problems? Are they welcoming for new contributors and new users? Do they treat each other with kindness and respect? You'll want to look carefully at how people treat each other on mailing lists, GitHub reviews, Slack, and any other communication channels. Projects with a culture of treating each other with respect and kindness are going to be a lower risk because your employees will want to continue to participate in those projects. On the other hand, projects with toxic cultures put your employees and other contributors at risk. There could be real health risks, both mental and physical, for your employees. And these toxic environments can impact retention, since employees might be so eager to leave the project that they will look for another employer where they won't have to work in this toxic community. And I've seen this happen, people leaving companies for this very reason, and I've seen it over and over. And if the culture is too toxic, it's pretty difficult or possibly even impossible to mitigate this risk. So if the community isn't amazing, this is a risk. It doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't get involved. There are no absolutes here, but you should approach it with a lot of caution and understand that things could really go terribly wrong if it gets even worse within the community and contributors just start disappearing. Open source projects that are designed to keep diversity, equity, and inclusion top of mind will be a lower risk. Building a diverse community where all people feel welcome and included does not just happen. It requires putting work and thought into it. I talked about codes of conduct earlier, and having a code of conduct that's actively enforced helps make everyone feel safe and welcome within your community. Providing an environment where everyone, including people from marginalized populations, feel safe is an important way to lower the risk of having your employees participate in a project. You should also look at whether the project has a diverse set of people at every level within the project, but especially in those top leadership positions. And if not, do they have active programs to help underrepresented folks get more involved and move up within the project? Ideally, having programs to give people opportunities for shadowing, mentoring, and sponsoring new potential leaders can help a project grow a diverse set of people into new leaders for the project. The Kubernetes Contributor Experience Special Interest Group is a great place to see some good examples of programs for things like shadowing and mentoring. Projects that make a concerted effort to bring in new people from a variety of backgrounds and have programs in place to help them grow into leadership positions are more likely to be lower risk, more likely to benefit from increased innovation, and just have healthier communities in general. And this increased innovation from a diverse community is particularly important from a strategic perspective for companies who use these projects. Diversity and inclusion can be difficult to measure, and a lot of times it is kind of a manual assessment, so you won't find this in a lot of your metrics tools. But we have defined some metrics within the CHAOSS Project's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Working Group. And I've included the link there at the bottom of the slide. So you can have a look for ideas about measuring various aspects of a project's diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we just had a brand new metrics release yesterday. So if you've looked at this before, there are actually some new ones on there. So have a look if you're interested in measuring diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you're actively using an open source project, it is likely that you will find bugs or want to contribute fixes back upstream. So for new projects that you're considering, you want to make sure that maintainers and other contributors typically respond in a timely fashion. Seeing large numbers of issues and pull requests on a project is a red flag for me because it can indicate that either they don't have enough contributors to handle the incoming contributions, or even worse, they don't actually care about contributions from other people, which is something you do see in some company-owned open source projects. Now, in some cases, you can help solve this problem by making contributions to open source project part of the job for your employees. However, there are legitimately some projects that really don't actually want contributions from people outside of their company or outside of their existing circle of maintainers. And this can happen when a project is open source for the wrong reasons, like marketing, politics, without real buy-in from the people who are responsible for that project. And these projects are a much higher risk since you are unlikely to be able to get any changes incorporated back into that upstream projects, which means that you end up carrying over patches and applying them, which is just no fun. Now, we don't always spend enough time thinking about the contributor risk associated with many open source projects. So for any open source projects we rely on, are there enough contributors that if one of them tomorrow won the lottery and retired on a beach, could the project continue with minimal disruptions? This is a bigger risk for projects that are highly complex or contain technologies that require specialized expertise, like we saw a few years ago with the OpenSSL Heartbleed example that I talked about earlier. Not everyone has that crypto experience. But you should also look at organizational diversity as part of the health and risk for open source projects. If all or most of the contributions come from the employees of a single company, what happens when that company has a shift in strategy or gets acquired or runs out of money and just goes out of business? Would the project be able to continue if the company pulled all of its employees out of the project? And again, it comes down to risk and whether you're willing to accept those risks. There are so many abandoned open source projects just sort of sprinkled across the internet. And there's no single reason the projects are abandoned. Technologies evolve, people change priorities, or maybe the community loses interest. One thing that can reduce the risk of embracing an open source project is if the project is adopted by a bunch of other companies, since active projects with plenty of users are a lot less likely to become abandoned. And it isn't always easy to know who uses a project, but an adopters file is a good place to start looking if the project has one. For CNCF projects, we usually put that in an adopters.md file. And having a strong user base helps reduce the risk that that project might be abandoned. Now, before I wrap up the talk, let me leave you with a few resources that you might find useful. The To-Do group has a bunch of guides that have great info about all aspects of creating and managing open source projects and open source program offices. I'm an active participant in the CNCF Contributor Strategy Technical Advisory Group, and we have a governance working group and a contributor growth working group, which provide guidance about contributor experience, sustainability, governance, openness, to help people develop strategies for maintaining healthy projects, healthy CNCF projects in this case, but it applies pretty much to any open source project. The Open Source Way guidebook has an entire chapter on governance, along with loads of other amazing details for open source projects. And these are all great starting places for understanding best practices for open source projects to help you evaluate your risks. Most business decisions boil down to an assessment of risk and then making trade-offs. We should all be thinking strategically about project risks in light of how we're using those projects within our business. If we build our products or product lines on top of an open source technology, we want it to be as low of a risk as possible. On the other hand, if we're using an open source project as a part of some maybe small, non-critical piece of infrastructure that really isn't that important, We can accept a lot more risk for those projects. Now, no project is all good or all bad, all risk or no risk, and no one solution will be right for every single situation. Project risk, like I mentioned earlier, exists on a continuum. Deciding which risks we're going to accept is the beginning and not the end of this process, since we should be thinking about how we can monitor and mitigate those risks over time. We need to think about the risks we might be taking and then make informed and strategic business decisions about which risks to accept. With that, thank you for coming to my talk.